Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn is a progressive campaign agency that specialises in community organising. We work with non-profit and community-based organisations, trade unions, progressive businesses and social democratic parties across the globe to develop campaign strategies, train engagement staff in leadership and power building, and help you execute your campaign with data-driven tactics and actions. And in 2022, Dunn will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories to inspire others, take action and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Today's episode is also proudly brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have the experience you need on your side when something goes wrong. They know the law inside and out and will explain every detail without legal jargon so you feel comfortable and fully understand your situation. And they know how the system works and have the expertise and resources to continue standing up for clients on matters where others might just give up. Find out more by visiting their website at mauriceblackburn.com.au. Hello and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast, out every Friday, that dives into the progressive campaign's issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And I'm back home again. Wonderful to be back in this shitty Melbourne weather. But on today's show, we are going to talk to Elliot Stein. We've had Elliot on the show heaps of times before. He's my economics budget nerd. And obviously the budget was delivered by Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, on Tuesday night. And Elliot's on the show today to help us unpack what was in the budget this week. And if you like the show, don't forget to give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify if you're done listening to the show, today's episode, and leave us a review on podcasts, Apple Podcasts and Podchaser. And for all of the updates for the show, don't forget to follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Okay, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Friday morning on the lands of the Wurundjeri people on a really shitty Melbourne day, I must admit. And joining me on the line from, I hope it's better weather where you are, to help me unpack this budget that we just had this week is the Head of Government and External Engagement at UNICEF Australia, Elliot Stein. Welcome back to Socially Democratic.
Thanks for having me back.
Now, I have to admit, we're going to unpack the budget, and I just need to let you know and let our audience know that I find the budget really boring, and it's completely out of my league. But I know it's important. We need to talk about this. I remember as a child when I was a teenager, I loved Paul Keating. Any opportunity I could get to listen to or watch Keating, I would. I'd tape Question Time, go get mum to tape Question Time when I'd come home from school, and then I'd watch Question Time just to see Keating in action in Parliament. And I remember I was sitting down to watch would it be one of his final budgets, I guess, before he challenged Hawke and then lost and got sent to the back bench. And I sat down to watch one of the budget addresses and with my mum and dad, and within the first 5 or 6 minutes, I remember stopping and turning around to my parents and going, "This is really boring." And I've kind of struggled with watching the budget because it's just so, it's very policy heavy. Everyone knows. If you've listened to this show before, I'm not a policy guy. I'm out of my depth when it comes to policy. That's why I get smart people like you on this show, Elliot, to help me unpack what the hell happened this week during the budget. So let's do that. Before we do, though, why are we having a budget in October? I thought this was a May thing.
So that's right. So traditionally, budgets are handed down in May for the coming fiscal year. So you hand it down in May, and then it kicks in from 1 July of that year. You say what you're going to do, you go and do it. We haven't had a May budget for a while. This year we had a March budget and an October budget, and we're looking down the barrel of doing a May budget next year. Why? The March one was brought forward by the former Morrison government on the basis that they were about to go to an election and they wanted to set out their budget. Quite uniquely, and this is the first time in budget history, we are having an entire redo budget. So this is the first time there have been 2 budgets for the same fiscal year, effectively redoing the work done previously. So the Albanese government committed to before the election that if it was elected, it would do both a fiscal and economic update, which was a statement done to the Parliament by the Treasurer, and then an entire October budget on the basis they wanted to hit the ground running. And the idea that if we were going to have an election in May, the idea of waiting a full 12 months to then hand down and lock in all of its commitments was too long to wait for this government. So we, by virtue of having an election early in the year and a government pretty keen to get cracking, we have ended up with the October 22-23 budget.
Now, interestingly enough, in your new role, I understand you were in the lockup room. For those of you out there that don't know what the hell a lockup room is and why we have that, just talk us through that whole experience.
Absolutely. So budget day is a weird and wonderful experience. The tip of the iceberg that people would see would be the Treasurer's speech at 7:30 p.m. On the night itself. For both commentators, media, markets, and nerds, we get a bit of a sneak peek, and it's called the budget lockup. So, budget lockup, it's a weird and wonderful world where time and space don't exist, where a combination of journalists, stakeholders, and all-round nerds get to have a thorough look through and read the budget before anybody else, on the basis that you stay in a windowless room, which you don't exit between anywhere. Media goes in at about 11. Stakeholders, such as myself, went in at around 4 p.m. And you get a stack of these, which I'm showing you now, which is all the different budget papers, and you get to read to your heart's content until 7:30, at which point Treasury officials open the doors and let you roam free to go and commentate on the budget. I'm
assuming here, Elliot, no phones, all that kind of stuff.
Your phone goes into a glad bag, like a sandwich glad bag with your name on it. You have to demonstrate that your laptop is totally non-communicative with the world. They turn off the public Wi-Fi at Parliament House. This is a locked box environment. I described the media one is slightly more enjoyable. There's more movement. The Treasurer comes through. The stakeholder lockup I could best describe as economy of a long-haul international flight. You're in a cocoon. Tables are stacked very closely together. There's a coffee urn in the middle of the room that has a low rumbling noise that sounds like an engine up against the fuselage. It is a weird experience. It is total silence for the first few hours rather. Somewhere around 6, people start congregating. You start to feel nervous because you heard the flight announcement about no more than 2 people can congregate near the bathroom at any one time. Mm-hmm. And groups start to coordinate and think about what they're going to say. It means when you see things like the Chamber of Commerce or the ACTU or others all standing up and commentating and reflecting and responding to the budget instantly after it's happened, it's because we've all had these 4 or 5 hours locked up with a chance to read it all beforehand. So I got to experience that for the first time, which is a very strange experience.
Do you know what? As a person who is an absolute policy Luddite, if you put me in that room and I started reading those documents, I'd be like, oh, this is gobbledygook. I don't know what the hell I'm looking at. I'd be so stressed going up. And it'd be like me in grade 4 cheating off Peter McKenna's maths essay or maths, test. Again, I'd be cheating off people because I would go, well, what do you think it says? Because I have no idea. So what do you think it said? Let's keep talking through this whole, so you're in the lockup.
Yeah.
Talk us through, actually, no. What were your expectations going into the room beforehand? That's actually what I'm interested in get your thoughts on.
So I'll do one better. I'll step back and tell you a story about how budget week sort of works from a media cycle point of view, from a thinking about it point of view.
Love it.
obviously the speech is on Tuesday. There are two anchors to the week: the Treasurer's speech on Tuesday and the Leader of the Opposition speech on Thursday. Every budget week sort of follows the same pattern, which is there are a series of either drops or legitimate leaks that sort of occur before Tuesday. Tuesday night, the speech happens. There was a flurry of media appearances on Tuesday night, and somewhere between 10 p.m. Tuesday and 6 a.m. Wednesday, the whole conversation starts to shape around one or two, normally only one thing. You then go into this weird time tunnel where you have handed down hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents, all of your commitments for the coming fiscal year, the government's entire agenda, sometimes laid out over 4 or 10 years, depending on which paper you're looking at. And yet the media and the commentariat all start to focus in on one question. That question changes from budget to budget, but it all sort of comes about one thing. So all of Wednesday, you start to answer one question. Most of Thursday, you're answering one question. And then somewhere around Thursday, after question time, the focus turns to, well, what will the opposition say? The opposition has their speech on the Thursday. There's a little bit of follow-up on Friday. And really by Sunday, you're just reading analysis about the week that was. Budget weeks follow a very, very similar pattern every week. And we saw it play out this week as well.
And so what were the expectations going into this particular budget? First budget for Labor, first budget for Jim Chalmers, Treasurer?
So the plan of this budget, and it was called in some circles, it was called a mini budget or a sort of a placeholder budget, and that was fairly accurate. The now government set out during election campaign its election commitments. I think it was called a Better Future for Australia, I think was the name of the document. It set out all of our costings, all of our commitments, all of our plans. And the government committed, if elected, that would hold a budget as soon as it could in order to implement all of those commitments for this fiscal year. So expectations in terms of measures and what was going to be contained in the budget was literally what were all of its election promises. That's what it's going to do. And really, with the exception of, which we'll come to in a minute, with the exception of the housing accord, everything of significance within the budget was exactly what was promised in its election commitments. It was as simple as picking up the election commitment document and turning it into a budget document. And that was the expectation. Now, since the election through to October 25, there have been all sorts of changing circumstances in particularly in the macroeconomic environment and the global economic environment that have really buffeted and shifted the macro settings and the budget outlook. But in terms of what it promised to do and what the expectations were, this is a budget that did what it said on the tin.
We'll talk about what those were in a moment. We'll do a sort of a bit of analysis and breakdown of things. Just I want to go back to that then. What was the question then? You said to me before that it comes down to one question. What was the question that then was starting to be framed by media, stakeholders, you name it?
My observation from this week is the single sort of dominant media frame has all been around power prices and energy prices. The government probably would have hoped that the conversation, if it was going to go into energy, would have turned on to what additional regulations or involvement in the market that the government might take to regulate or do more or intervene into the energy market. It sort of laid some foundations and put some breadcrumbs on that question. Unfortunately for the government, the question really turned onto a commitment that it made during the election campaign to reduce power prices by a certain number. I think it was $275 from memory. The whole media narrative has really turned on that question because between that modelling being done in 2021 with an expectation that that wouldn't come in until 2025, that's really been the question that people have latched onto. And I don't think the government will be pleased that that is where the narrative has gone. But as we said at the outset, every budget becomes about one thing, and then the week moves on. And the opportunity for the government now is, as the weeks roll on and the next thing happens, they've now got their own blueprint, their own documents, their own commitments to go off and sell and evangelize and speak about. But for budget week itself, it all came down to $275.
We'll talk about that energy stuff in a moment, but before we do, just give us a bit of an overall snapshot of the budget. What was in it for folks that in a sort of in the policy areas? Where do they sort of deep dive and focus in on in this?
So this is a really unique budget. It's on the backdrop of unbelievably high inflation that's not been seen since the early 90s. The day after the budget, it was confirmed that inflation was sitting around 7%. So you had a high inflationary backdrop combined with almost full employment, unbelievably high employment. You've got the backdrop of a war in Ukraine and all sorts of, combined with a sort of a global synchronized tightening of monetary policy and increasing interest rates globally as well. So it was a really unique set of circumstances, all of which meant that what the government would have liked to have done compared to what it could do was quite limited. It wanted to be able to give cost of living relief to families and individuals, but it needed to do so in a way that wasn't going to fuel what the Treasurer called the inflation dragon. So as a consequence, what they put together was any cost of living relief had to have a productivity dividend attached to it, and also had to have quite a long implementation tail as well. So what does that mean? The government would say it had 5 key priorities for cost of living relief that were non-inflationary: cheaper childcare, greater access to paid parental leave, cheaper medicines, building more housing stock, and getting wages moving. That was its 5 points, all of which are non-inflationary by definition. So that was its measures, but all sitting on this backdrop of probably the most uncertain, difficult macroeconomic settings, definitely in any of our lifetimes.
So let's start with the wages. How are they going to get wages moving? I think that's interesting. So I guess conservative economists are saying that if you try and drive up wages, then that's going to heat the economy and add to the problem of inflation. So I'm interested in getting a sense of how they're going to do that.
Yeah, so that's definitely the case. You hear some commentary talking about inflationary pressures from wages. You don't hear that said too much when you're talking about the top end of town getting massive take-home bonuses or performance bonuses. They never refer to, don't want to name names, but they never refer to CEOs of major airlines getting significant take-home bonuses for performance payouts as being inflationary when their personal take-home pay might be more than their lowest paid workers. So really what the government's talking about is unfreezing and unlocking particularly the lowest paid workers as a fuel for the rest of the wage system. It's done it in a few ways already. It supported, I think everyone might remember from the election campaign, the Prime Minister's gold coin that he would hold up. So it supported and saw an increase in the minimum wage early on. It has put in a submission to the Fair Work Commission to boost the pay of aged care workers. Again, some of the lowest paid, even within their own sector, within the care sector, some of the lowest paid workers are aged care workers. So it is supporting a wage rise for that section of workers as well. And also on Wednesday, the government introduced, really off the back of of the Job Summit, they introduced a industrial relations reform bill, which had a few measures in there of really trying to unlock and get the EBA system, the enterprise bargaining agreement system, working again. I think there's consensus around both employer and employee groups that the current system has sort of collapsed upon its own weight, and there are some absolutely intractable disputes which are really stopping wages getting rolling again.
So wages. Let's talk about some of the other areas that you just mentioned that they focused on. Parental leave was another one. What was the key announcements to come out of the budget in that respect?
So the main part about the paid parental leave was to expand the scheme to reach 26 weeks paid parental leave and I was particularly thrilled to see this because it's something that we had advocated for before a Senate committee recently, was a use it or lose it provision as well, to encourage both parents, where there are two parents, to encourage both parents to take up elements of that 26 weeks as part of paid parental leave. And now, whether it's paid parental leave or childcare, there is a very obvious rights to the child and educational outcomes of the child benefit to this as well. But there is a huge economic dividend delivered, which is what we were talking about before, about saying cost of living relief, where it comes with a productivity dividend by getting more women back into the workforce, particularly women back into the workforce, and ensuring that that childcare is not a detriment to careers and therefore the economy itself. So both boosting paid parental leave and expanding out and changing some of the subsidy arrangements for childcare were all about fueling the economy, as well as obviously the educational and development outcomes for children as well.
You mentioned housing as well. I'm just interested in what it sounded like the Kiwi build policy that Jacinda Ardern and the Labor government had took to the election a couple of years ago. What's the announcements around housing?
So housing was the big was actually the big surprise of the night. As I said, everything else that was largely everything else that was in the budget was as promised, as committed, as expected. The housing accord, which actually was a legitimate leak. It was leaked on, I think, Tuesday morning of budget day, maybe late Monday night. Was unexpected. It was a leak which I'm surprised it held for as long as it did. This is a housing accord between state and territory and federal governments, along with the private sector, with a commitment to build 1 million homes, if I've got my figures correct, and fingers crossed that I do, to build a million homes over 5 years. Now, some would say that is just a return to the sort of numbers that we were seeing pre-pandemic, but I think everyone would recognise that just because something was a trend or a number of houses being built pre-pandemic is no guarantee that they're going to be built today as well. So that included, there was some social housing sitting within that, 10,000 new affordable homes, along with a commitment of another 10,000 from the state and territory governments, taking that up to 20,000 new homes, along with an aspiration to build 1 million new well-located homes over 5 years from 2024 onwards as well. And I'm sure anyone who's been in the housing market or has friends in the housing market would appreciate why that's required. And that was really the big ta-da. And within the budget itself, that million homes commitment.
What about climate change? Obviously, we're talking a lot about that at the moment, particularly as parts of New South Wales and Victoria are underwater, and we're heading into bushfire season as well. Climate's obviously on the front of everyone's minds. We've got a state election coming up in Victoria late November. Climate's one of the issues on the agenda. What have we heard from the government in terms of climate addressing that?
So the biggest part about climate as it impacted the budget, obviously Minister Bowen has already legislated and got through the Parliament the carbon reduction target based off the modelling. Climate is one of those things that it's very hard to see particularly given we're not going down the model of cap and trade or tax. It's hard to see it carried out in the budget as a line item. The biggest thing, or the two biggest things that I want to highlight about climate in particular, the first is in budget paper number 1, which for those playing at home is the strategy and outlook paper for the true fans. The biggest part about that is there was a dedicated section of the budget called Fiscal Impacts of Climate Change. This also dovetailed nicely with the government's introduction of a wellbeing statement as well. This is all in the context of measuring what matters and measuring things differently. I think we've all heard about CPI and the basket of goods and measuring ins and outs of the economy, widgets in and money out. What this budget has done for the first time ever, it has a dedicated section about what is the fiscal impact of climate change to both the budget and to the country, and also has a wellbeing statement around measuring a whole range of metrics around the OECD about what is the well-being of the nation, not just the well-being of its balance sheet as well. So that's one big part about what this budget did, which is different, which was talking about measuring fiscal impacts of climate change. That will only be increased over coming budgets. This was a bit of a toe in the water of demonstrating that. The other big thing in terms of actual measures in our good friend budget paper number 2 was an investment to the Department of Climate Change to step up Australia's international engagement on climate change. And that was really all part of the government's commitment to seek to host a future COP meeting, which is the Committee of the Parties meeting. People might know that from the Glasgow COP or the Copenhagen COP of years gone by. The coming COP in November will be held in Egypt. Australia will be putting its hand up to host a COP meeting itself, and there were some budget allocations for that.
The other thing that Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, had spoke about in the lead up to the budget was really starting to cut out a lot of government waste and rorts and all that kind of stuff. What did we see in the papers with respect to that particular area of focus?
Yeah, no, I'm glad you've brought me to that. Another big part about the budget was about committing to budget repair. So on both trying to reduce the size of the deficit and starting to bring down the cost of debt as well. And you'll hear the government talking about wanting to have debt but something to show for it. And so it was a key critique of the previous government that this government has made, which is there was $1 trillion of debt and nothing to show for it. Two really substantial things to point out, which if anyone is talking about performance of fiscal management, I think this might speak for itself. The first is the government identified $28.5 billion in budget improvements over the what's called the forward estimates, which is the 4 years captured within the budget. 22 billion of that was identified by its waste and rorts process. So that was shaving down the cost of things like sports rorts or regional rorts or any of these sort of high volume of discretionary funding that had slipped into the budget over the course of the last decade or so. There was also a big reduction in the costs of external labour, consultants, advertising, travel, and the rest of it. So that was 28.5 bill over 4 years that got cleaned up and cut, obviously without going to services. The other really substantial thing, which is very hard to get anyone excited about, but I think is absolutely phenomenal, which is I know I can hear the people just turning up their radios as we speak. Is the really exciting thing that happened in the budget is there was a massive not write down, write up of tax receipts due to a series of changing economic circumstances. The amount of money that the government expected to raise and bring in through taxation, not through policy change, but just through changing circumstances, one of which is there's more employment and therefore there is more income tax, for example. Some royalties got written up and the rest. There was actually a significant windfall. You hear about windfall taxes. There was a significant windfall the government made in tax receipts. It brought in more. The choice the governments then have when they get more money than they were expecting is you can save it or you can bank it. And this time, the government did something which, and I'll run you through the stats in a minute, but this did something that has never been done before, which is over 2 years, over the coming 2 years, 99% of the increased taxation revenue is going straight back onto the budget. And over 4 years, it's 92%. these figures have not been seen for a while. To give you a sense, when the Howard and Costello governments were in and they had similar sort of increases in taxation windfall, they returned about 30% to the budget. The previous Liberal government returned about 40%. Even the Rudd, Gillard and Swan budgets only returned about 80%. So to return 99% of increased taxation windfall to the budget as a consequence of reducing interest on servicing our debt and our payments by to the tune of about 47 billion is unbelievable fiscal restraint. You can imagine what it would be like sitting around that expenditure review committee when you're a Labor government who wants to do good things and wants to do more. When you see this massive write-up and this extra money, the temptation is so strong to do something with it and to deploy it. But in this high inflationary pressure, in a context where the budget is frankly cooked, banking that is unbelievably fiscally restrained. And that's the really big story about this budget when it comes to just the sheer management of the exercise.
What do you think influenced the government in making that decision? Do you think is it related to inflation?
I think there's a very strong desire to not be inflationary in any of its measures. It's also a reflection that there is somewhere, we're projected to hit $1 trillion worth of debt. That the budget is still deeply in deficit. I think you can definitely see this reflected in the Treasurer went to the meeting of both the G20 and the IMF 2 weeks before the budget, and he got to see, not unlike Treasurer Swan did on the eve of the global financial crisis, he got to see into the whites of the eyes of the other global economies around the world who are staring down the barrel potentially of a synchronized global recession, and realized the buffers that we need at home, or at least reiterated to him the buffers that we need at home to ensure that we are able to withstand what could well be the third global economic crisis in 15 years.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, after we went through COVID, obviously the former Liberal government really dipped into a lot of our savings to, prop up and protect the Australian economy. Is that in the back of our minds as well, that we've kind of gone into our savings in the last 2 years and we probably need to start to refill that little bank account going forward?
Absolutely. Like we need the buffer back. If anything, that either COVID or the last 6 months in terms of this inflation and synchronized monetary tightening policy has shown us is that expect the unexpected. And the global economy is going through some real headwinds right now, and you want a bit of ballast in the tank. So we're ready to fight what could be yet another storm coming to us.
Look, and I don't want to turn this into a foreign policy podcast by any stretch of imagination, but when I was overseas and I was talking to some folks when we were doing some of those meetings with the Dunn Street Mission, some big global businesses around the world are worried about what's going on in the Ukraine, how long that's going to drag on. We're about to go into a European winter. Yeah. This uncertainty around Putin and the Russians, they're obviously clearly this planned invasion has not gone to the way that they thought it would. They sort of wrap it up in a couple of weeks' time. It's dragging on. It's going to drag through the winter. It looks like that the Ukrainians are holding their positions and now starting to move into sort of that eastern part of their country and taking back a lot of stuff that the Russians got early. How Putin responds to that, how long this drags on for, where are we going? I hate, like this threat of nuclear war is on the cards as well. Like it's kind of insane when you think about it, really.
Yeah.
And if that drags on, then obviously that's having an impact in Europe, in the European markets. They're heading to their winter. People need, gas to keep their homes warm. I see the Germans are dropping $12 billion to pay for everyone's gas bills come this December. So there's an example of a government inserting itself directly into the market around cost of living measures. What's going through the minds of the Australian government as we look at what's happening around the world? I mean, I just want to get your thoughts. Can we start to talk about the cost of living, energy prices, that kind of stuff? How there must be a lot of pressure from the media on the government to do something about it right now, but I just don't know what we actually can do without ourselves actually starting to buy back coal-fired gas stations and all that kind of shit. Like we're not a socialist government. So where do we go from here? How do we address this problem?
Well, the medium and long-term answer, as in all things, comes back to climate change and becoming the renewable superpower that we can be and need to be, and becoming effectively energy self-sufficient through virtue of having all the natural resources that we need right here to be able to do that, whether it's wind, sun, what have you. So that's sort of the medium to long-term reality. But you're right. In the short term, the war in Ukraine is driving massive price rises and has brought about through the shock through the system that it's caused, has brought about and exacerbated both inflationary pressures and also, as a consequence, the tightening of monetary policy, which is a fancy way of saying rising interest rates. So those two things together means that anything the government might want to do, and you saw some, the former government introduced it suspended the rebate on petrol for a short period of time, but anything the government might want to do on energy prices directly could be inflationary. What it has foreshadowed is finding a way to have either intervention or regulation back into the energy market, whether that's and obviously in Australia there are two energy markets. There is the West Coast and the East Coast. The West Coast is not experiencing some of the energy price shocks that the East Coast is expecting, largely due to some of its reservation policies and its retention of some of its own energy prior to export. The government is making all sorts of noises around similar things for the East Coast market. It said nothing definitive, but anyone trying to pay a electricity bill at the moment would know just how tough that is. It's obviously made some big investments with the Powering Australia plan, with rewiring the nation, of trying to get all the systems it needs in place to move energy around in a different way than it has previously, in a very simple way, where the sources of energy are currently and not the same places where they are going to be. And so as a consequence, you need to ensure that there are transmission lines and cables and connectors that will physically move energy around again. That is absolutely critical. But in the short term, it's making some noises about wanting to do some more in the intervention space.
The tax cuts, the stage 3 tax cuts, that will Labor or won't Labor honour that promise that they made when a year ago? Has that issue been put to bed now?
My sense is that it is for the time being, and I think there is a few in the commentariat space who have encouraged and created a debate only to then to shut it down, only to say that it might come back again, which is probably reflective of government thinking. It's no secret that in opposition, Labor did not support what we refer to as the stage 3 element of tax cuts. We know that they don't start for a number of years. I think there was some very light balloon floating prior to the budget around the cost this would have on the budget. Is this the right thing to do? Coming head to head with a election commitment. This is a government that is, as we've been going through with the budget, this is a government that is doing what it said it would do. And it made some pretty clear definitive statements around its view on the stage 3 tax cuts. In terms of this budget, there are no changes to that. Is the door open for it to be looked at again in May? Maybe a little tiny bit. The door might be unlocked, but it looks pretty closed to me. And these are legislated tax cuts. If the government wants to make any alterations, it literally needs to introduce a bill to increase taxes. And these are taxes that don't these are tax cuts that don't kick in still for another fiscal year. So there is time, but also, as we've been discussing, the economic circumstances could be massively changed by then as well. The government has put a high premium on being both honest and responsible when it comes to the budget, and mature in how it's talking about some of these things. But if you force my hand and made me put a bet on right now, as we've done in other contexts, I would say it would be highly unlikely for there to be any change to the stage 3 tax cuts.
Economically, is it smart to not bring forward these or implement these tax cuts? In a perfect world, I know that.
I mean, in a perfect world, would you be doing them in the way that you were doing them? Probably not, and that's what the now government said in opposition. It didn't think that was the best deployment of resources to a problem. You've definitely not heard, although in last night's speech by the leader of the opposition, there was a very strong and fulsome defence of these tax cuts. You've not heard that same sort of vigorous defence by the government of the now government. In a perfect world, would you be doing them? No, but a government's only good as its word, and it made a promise.
Yeah, I find it interesting. Like, I just wonder if I feel like we get kind of like the media are just waiting. They're kind of baiting them, aren't they, to go back on their decision, and then when they do, they're going to absolutely beat the living shit out of them. And I just sort of think the federal Labor needs to stop giving a shit about what the media think. Like, governments don't live and die by the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald or the Tally or the Courier Mail or the Herald Sun or the Age. So if they think it's the right thing to do, I think they should just do it and tell the journalists to go root a boot.
I agree with most of that. But we've all seen governments that have walked back from something they promised to do, and that's got nothing to do with the media coverage. That's got everything to do with what people perceive as promises and word as bond. I do think definitely prior to the budget, and it's starting again, there is this, there is the siren song from the rocks saying, "Come hither," as the boat gets closer into the rocks. And I do think that we've seen that movie before as well, of people egging on governments to take as Sir Humphrey would say, a courageous decision, only to be the ones that criticise them straight away.
We're spooked by the Keating LAW law tax cuts, and quite frankly, we lost our election not because of that. We lost our election because we've been in power for 13 years, and Keating had pissed off everyone, really. And I say it as a guy who loves Paul Keating, so like, it wasn't that wasn't the reason. Anyway, let's move on. Who are the winners out of this? Let's do the cliche post-election, post-budget analysis. Who are the winners out of this one, Elliot?
Again, given how I got two for you. You'll be shocked to hear this. Families were the winner.
Woohoo!
Cheaper childcare, better paid parental leave, cheaper medicines. That is all aimed squarely at families. I'll give a quick plug just from our own sector. $1.4 billion increase to our overseas development aid, foreign aid. 900 million to the Pacific, 450 odd million to Southeast Asia. One of the single biggest increases in overseas development assistance in over a decade. Unbelievably important. I think sometimes the sector gets a little bit obsessed about numbers and percentages and comparisons. That's all sort of interesting but irrelevant. This is real increase in funding. 1.4 billion in additional money, restoring Australia's position as a significant contributor to the aid and development to our world, and particularly to our Pacific region. Between that and restoring our credentials on climate change, it is a very clear signal from both Ministers Wong and Conroy that Australia is stepping back up as its role as a significant middle power and as a friend to the Pacific as well. So I would say that one of the biggest winners is the aid and development sector. and I am absolutely trumpeting that. And I was fist pumping in budget lockup when I saw that.
Good stuff. And who are the losers out of this budget?
Well, because it was such a as you expect kind of budget. It'd be wrong to say that there were any losers. A bad day to be at PwC, I would have thought, with the cut to the consultant budget. Not a great day to be someone who wants to see profligate spending without a productivity increase. There weren't the usual sort of losers, as I would say, within this budget. We could probably make a snide reference that the real losers happened in May, and they would have felt it on budget night.
Been snide away, absolutely.
As a dear friend of mine would often say, a friend of ours actually, you never feel more in opposition than on budget night, and it all starts to feel pretty real at that point.
And then in the wash-up, how was it received? Starting, I want to cover off a couple of groups here. First of all, starting with stakeholders in the sort of the community social sector. How did they receive this budget?
I think pretty well across the board. It's definitely, both within lockup and afterwards, I think you saw a pretty muted but positive response. Going back to what I said earlier, it's a budget that did what it said in the tin. There were no surprises. There was nothing announced that was unexpected. There's a whole, I'll just do a quick little sidebar, but there's a whole tension constantly within budget communications framing about how much you tip out before and how much you hold back. The government showed it's working and showed its homework over the weeks leading into the budget. The housing accord was really the only thing that it held back, and that came to light Tuesday morning. So across the board, the stakeholder response has been, "Oh, yep, that's what we thought it was going to be, and there it is." So it's been pretty straightforward, if I can say that. For such a substantial piece of work, it is a very straightforward document.
And big end of town, big business, they happy, or what's the story there?
So I was sat opposite the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry in lockup, so I got a bit of a real time sense of what they were doing. I don't want to speak, obviously it was a private room, so I don't want to speak too ill of them, but they were going through looking for keywords in budget speeches and documents and couldn't find the usual sort of markers they would have. I think the Australian Financial Review made the point that although this treasurer is connected and plugged in and responsive to the business community, it is a very different vibe compared to the previous treasurer, Josh Frydenberg, and his relentless hand-to-hand networking of the top end of town. This is it was pointed out to me, and I guess I fall into this category with my UNICEF lanyard on. There was a lot more of civil society around the building on Tuesday. There was a lot more in the social wellbeing communities. You'd be unsurprised, there were a lot more trade unions walking around the building on Tuesday. So top end of town again, unsurprised. Not being as maybe not being as fated as in previous, but definitely not being shunned.
And what about the media? How do they report it?
Yeah, so the media really, as I sort of said at the outset, they all drilled down and tried to find what's our one thing. My suspicion walking into budget week was that unlike other years, this budget would be more about the macro than it would be about the measures, and that was largely right. Good luck finding a front page that didn't have the word inflation on it, or global headwinds, or the growth write-downs. mentioned, like this is a budget well and truly defined by what was going on around it. They really drilled in and focused on, as I was saying, this $275 commitment made election concerning electricity prices. The government spent a lot of time and energy defending and pushing back on that frame. But with that one measure exception, the majority of the coverage is really around the macro circumstances.
And this is the nation's first look at Jim Chalmers as Treasurer. This is his first big test in the embryonic stages of a brand new Labor government. How did Jim come through this whole process?
Anyone who's known Jim for a while or has had the pleasure of working for him or running his first campaign actually, as I've had the great pleasure of doing with some good friends, including some hosts, some guests that have been on your podcast as well, all helped in that effort. Seeing the fruition of his decades of commitment and hard work to both the party and also to the nation come to fruition on October 25th was a great thrill. I think it's been really marked by his candour and his openness to having big, hard, difficult debates in public view and being unashamed about setting out all the challenges and explaining how we're managing them. This was not a budget night where we pretended it was either the land of milk and honey or sunshine and lollipops. This is really difficult stuff. This is really challenging, and the Treasurer was pretty upfront with the Australian people all through his speech and in the budget itself about that.
It was also a lovely moment, given the fact that he was the former Chief of Staff to the last Labor Treasurer. That's what it was. Yeah.
Well, with the exception of Chris Bowen was Treasurer for a few months at the end, but the last Labor Treasurer to hand out a budget.
Correct. And then now he's at the dispatch box delivering a budget that's pretty cool.
He as he made the point on Wednesday to the National Press Club, he said probably, I think definitely, is the person within the Parliament who has had the most direct experience in putting together and responding to budgets. This was his 18th budget lockup in either as a opposition staffer, government staffer, opposition shadow minister, and now Treasurer. And that's probably the most of anybody else in the Parliament. And I dare say, well and truly more than even some of the Treasury officials as well. He is the most. I was trying to think of another comparison during the week, but he is the person who has come to the most fully formed and the most experienced coming into the Treasury portfolio. I really struggle to think of somebody with more experience walking into that job, knowing the officials, knowing the budget, knowing the economic landscape, having the global connections, as well as being deeply rooted in his community of Logan as well. It's hard to think of somebody who has had more experience taking the reins at the time that we need experience the most.
And still young. I mean, Jim's,
Oh, it's dreadful. No, it's atrocious. Yeah,
I know, all that experience, and he's like 23, 24. It's remarkable.
He's thankfully growing up, so we all start to feel a little bit less.
Yeah, exactly. And one other thing I'll say about Jim, great communicator as well. Like, it's not easy to communicate, difficult, complex concepts and then communicate it to every man and woman on the street. I think he's a great communicator in a difficult portfolio, which is really, really important, I think, from a politics standpoint anyway.
Well, I'm really excited that this is the launch of our 6-part podcast series of Why We Love Jim.
That's true. All right.
I have to get rotating guests on.
I know. Let's just end on a last question, which was obviously then on where Thursday night the Libs, the opposition, then give their response. Any thoughts? I didn't watch it. If I'm not going to watch Jim's buddy's performance, I'm not going to watch the Tories. How did they go? How did Dutton go with his reply?
And I'll confess, I've only read the transcript. I've not seen the video either. I had a work function last night as well. The key takeaway from a media point of view has been I think it was oblique, but he made a reference to nuclear power as part of the firming up of our energy systems, which has been latched onto a fair bit. As in all, there's been a bit of stick around on this. I think, as in all first time budget reply speeches from a new leader, there was a heavy focus on the personal narrative and the explaining to the nation who he is. It was a very policy light contribution. I think being momentarily objective, that is actually what you would expect from a very quick election commitment style budget going into what could be, there could be 4 budgets over the course of this first term of government or this course of this parliament. If I were Dutton or advising Dutton, what he did last night is actually what you'd suggest. It told the story about who he was. It wasn't too negative. I think the raising nuclear power says more about some internal dynamics than it does about an actual agenda for the nation. It was a pretty much a paint by numbers kind of job.
It's funny, because I do recall as a younger man that when the opposition gave their right of reply, they tried to make an economic argument based on not having actually access to the figures. So it must have been a pretty difficult task, really, to kind of say, well, this is how I'd spend the money. And then Abbott, in his first, I think, right of reply, didn't do that and just went the tonk, if I could coin a phrase from backyard cricket, my batting style. He just went the tonk on the then Gillard government, and it kind of set the precedent, I think, from then on, because remember, then Bill's first budget right of reply was after the Tories brought in all those budget cuts. He gave that great speech, which was more of a political argument why these budget cuts were wrong as opposed to an economic argument, and it really kind of helped, I think, Bill's leadership both within the party and then more broadly within the community. So I guess since then, really, these budget replies have really been more political statements, haven't they? So it's interesting you see that Dunn's continued on that trend.
Yeah, and I was talking to a few mates who had done the hard opposition years over the last 9, including for under both Shorten and Albanese, and they described the if stakeholder lockup was hard, it's nothing compared to being the alternative government and trying to digest pages and pages and pages and pages, formulate an instant response for Tuesday night, and try to then articulate a smart comment to make with this looming ticking clock deadline of Thursday 7:30 p.m. on primetime TV. That is a tall ask for anybody involved, and as a consequence, you can see why in some of these speeches are really lent to, here's what I was going to say anyway, here's the sort of top and tail of the lines of the day, and here's who I am. It's a bit of an easier ask than a full budget critique.
Well, suck it, because that's what happens when you lose elections. Elliot, thank you so much for coming on the show today. If we reverse roles and you were asking the questions and I was doing the answers, my God, it would be a terrible podcast. But you did a fantastic job today. I really appreciate your time. Great to see you again. Good luck with the new role. And we hope to have you back on the show in the near future.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday. Socially Democratic was brought to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Maurice Blackburn Lawyers have spent more than a century paving the hard path to justice for everyday Australians. They've helped over 500,000 Australians turn their situation around, and they know how the system works. Their experience and skills means you'll get the best results possible. Find out more on their website, mauriceblackburn.com.au. Maurice Blackburn, experience you can count on.